When I was 15, I wasn't thinking about responsibilities, bills, or what it meant to be independent. I was just a kid who loved tinkering with tech. Fixing old laptops and phones started as a hobby, but when a neighbor offered to pay me for fixing her broken tablet, something clicked. Before long, word spread, and I found myself juggling school and a steady stream of repair requests. By 17, I had a full-blown side hustle, pulling in what felt like serious money for a teenager. I was proud of myself, but my parents saw things differently. I still remember the night they sat me down in the living room. My mom had that overly sweet tone she used when she was about to drop bad news. "Ethan," she began, "your dad and I have been talking, and we think it's time you started contributing to the household." I was confused at first. Contribute? Like chores? I already do that. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice thick with false warmth. "We're talking about rent." Rent? The word hung in the air like a bad joke, but neither of them laughed. My dad leaned in, his voice gruff and matter-of-fact. "You're making good money now. It's only fair. $200 a month starting next week." I didn't argue. I mean, what was I supposed to say? I figured maybe this was normal, something all families did to teach their kids responsibility. Besides, $200 wasn't much compared to what I was earning. I could handle it. At first, it felt manageable. I paid the rent, kept working on my business, and didn't think too hard about it. But slowly, things started to shift. My parents stopped treating me like their son, and more like a boarder who happened to share their last name. My room wasn't my space anymore. It was the room you rent. My mom would walk in without knocking, reorganizing my desk or moving my things around. "Just making sure it's tidy," she'd say with a smile, but it never felt like a kind gesture. It felt invasive, like she was reminding me whose house it really was. When I tried to set boundaries, locking my door or asking her to knock, she'd act like I was overreacting. "Ethan, don't be ridiculous. This is my house. If you're hiding something, just say it." It didn't matter how often I told her it wasn't about hiding anything. She didn't listen. By the time I turned 18, things had only gotten worse. I started buying my own groceries because family dinners became a battleground. If I missed a meal because I was working late or hanging out with friends, my mom would guilt-trip me about abandoning the family. Once, she cooked a big dinner and didn't even tell me. I came home late, only to find them sitting at the table, clearly halfway through the meal. "Oh, you're home," my dad said. "Too busy for us again, I see." It was exhausting. The worst part was how they seemed to flip back and forth between treating me like a tenant and treating me like a child. I was paying rent, buying my own food, and handling my own laundry, but if I did anything they didn't approve of, it was like I was 12 again. One night, I stayed out late with some friends, and when I got home, my dad was waiting in the living room. "You think this is a hotel?" he barked. "You can't just come and go as you please." I stared at him, completely thrown. "I'm paying you rent," I said. "How is this any different from me living on my own?" That didn't go over well. He launched into a lecture about respect, responsibility, and how I owed them for everything they'd done for me. I didn't say much after that. What was the point? They weren't interested in listening, only in being right. By the time I hit 21, I was in my final year of college, running a successful freelance tech repair business, and counting the days until I could graduate and leave. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a hostile environment. I spent most of my time in my room, keeping my head down and avoiding unnecessary conversations with my parents. But even then, they found ways to needle me. One day, I was doing laundry late at night when my mom stormed into the laundry room. "You're disrupting the household," she snapped. I stared at her, baffled. "How?" I asked. "I'm literally doing my own laundry." She didn't have a real answer, just a vague complaint about the family schedule, which didn't make any sense since I wasn't even part of their meal plans or daily routines anymore. It felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. I was living like an independent adult, but they still wanted to control every aspect of my life. I started to wonder, if I was already handling everything on my own, what was the point of staying? Something had to change, but I wasn't sure how to make the first move. A few weeks after the laundry room argument, I decided I couldn't keep living like that. The constant tension, the guilt trips, the control. It was all too much. But the thought of confronting my parents about leaving filled me with dread. I knew how they'd react. Accusations of being ungrateful, endless lectures about family loyalty, and probably some kind of emotional breakdown from my mom. I needed to plan carefully. I started by reaching out to my grandfather. He'd always been the one person in my family who seemed to understand me. Growing up, he was the one who taught me practical skills, like how to change a tire or balance a budget. He'd supported my tech business from the start, even loaning me money to buy better tools when I was 16. If anyone could help me figure out what to do next, it was him. I called him one evening, pacing back and forth in my room as I explained everything. The rent, the constant invasions of privacy, the emotional manipulation. It all spilled out like I'd been holding it in for years. He didn't interrupt, just listened quietly until I ran out of words. When I finally stopped, there was a long pause before he spoke. "You don't have to live like that, Ethan," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're an adult now. You've been carrying yourself like one for years. If they don't respect that, then maybe it's time to get out of there." His words hit me like a wake-up call. I'd been so caught up in trying to avoid conflict with my parents that I hadn't allowed myself to seriously consider leaving. But he wasn't done. "I've got plenty of space here," he continued. "If you need somewhere to stay while you figure things out, my door's always open." The offer caught me off guard. Grandpa's house was about an hour away in a quiet, semi-rural area. It wasn't glamorous, but it sounded like paradise compared to the suffocating atmosphere at home. Still, part of me hesitated. Moving in with him felt like admitting defeat, like I couldn't handle being fully independent yet. "I'll think about it," I told him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Take your time," he said. "Just remember, there's no shame in needing a fresh start." After we hung up, I sat on my bed for a long time, staring at the wall. The idea of leaving felt huge, almost too big to wrap my head around. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't keep putting it off. Grandpa was right. I needed a fresh start, and staying under my parents' roof wasn't going to give me that. The next few days were a blur of quiet planning. I started going through my stuff, sorting what I'd take with me and what I could leave behind. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing, mostly because I wasn't ready for the inevitable confrontation. Instead, I kept my head down, avoided unnecessary conversations, and tried to prepare myself mentally for the fallout. Of course, it didn't take long for them to notice something was up. One night, I was packing some old tech gear into a box when my dad walked into my room without knocking, as usual. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the box. I froze for a second, then decided there was no point in lying. "I'm getting ready to move out," I said simply, bracing myself for the reaction. He stared at me like I just said I was joining the circus. "Move out? Where the hell are you going?" "Grandpa's," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He offered to let me stay with him while I figure out my next steps. The explosion I'd been expecting came almost immediately. "So you're just running away?" he snapped. "After everything your mother and I have done for you? After we gave you a roof over your head? Food? Everything?" I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I've been paying for that roof," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "For years. I've been paying rent, buying my own groceries, handling my own life. This isn't me running away. It's me finally leaving a situation that isn't working." My mom appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why? What did we do to make you hate us so much?" "I don't hate you," I said, sighing, "but I can't keep living like this. You treat me like a tenant one minute and a child the next. I'm trying to be independent, but you won't let me. I need space." Her tears started almost immediately. "We're just trying to help you," she said between sobs. "We've only ever wanted what's best for you." I wanted to believe her, but years of resentment bubbled up before I could stop it. "Charging me rent when I was still in high school wasn't helping me," I said. "Invading my privacy, guilt-tripping me every time I made a decision you didn't like, that wasn't helping either." The room fell silent. My dad's jaw tightened, and my mom just stared at me, her face crumpling as the tears kept coming. For a moment, I felt guilty, but then I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't leaving to hurt them. I was leaving to save myself. I'm leaving at the end of the month, I said firmly. I'm not doing this to punish you. I just need to figure out my own life without all this tension. Neither of them responded. My mom walked out of the room, still crying, and my dad stood there for a moment before shaking his head and leaving without another word. I sat down on my bed, my heart pounding. It wasn't the clean break I'd hoped for, but at least it was out in the open now. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. And despite the chaos, that thought gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The days after I told my parents I was leaving felt like walking through a minefield. They didn't talk to me much, but when they did, their words were clipped and loaded with passive-aggressive undertones. My dad would comment about how real life isn't as easy as you think, while my mom made a habit of sighing dramatically whenever I walked into the room. It was like they were trying to guilt me into staying without actually saying the words out loud. I kept my head down and focused on packing. It was harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much stuff I'd accumulated over the years, and sorting through it felt like peeling back layers of my life. Old school notebooks, random souvenirs, gadgets I'd fixed up but never used. It all brought back memories, some good, some not so much. I found a picture of me with my parents from a vacation we took when I was about 10. We looked happy, carefree even, and for a second, I wondered if I was making a mistake. But then I reminded myself of how things had been for the past few years and pushed the thought aside. Grandpa called every couple of days to check in, and those conversations were my lifeline. He didn't ask for details, didn't push me to talk about the tension at home, just reminded me that I had a place to go and that I wasn't alone. "You're doing the right thing," he said during one call. "Sometimes you have to put yourself first, even when it's hard." As the end of the month approached, the atmosphere at home grew heavier. My mom started hovering more, making comments about how the house would feel so empty without me. My dad mostly avoided me, though occasionally he'd throw out remarks like, "I hope you're ready for how expensive it is out there." I didn't engage. There was no point. They weren't trying to have a real conversation. They just wanted me to feel bad. Then, 3 days before I was supposed to leave, my mom knocked on my door. That alone was unusual. She almost never knocked. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She sat down on the edge of my bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, she just looked around the room, like she was taking it all in. "I don't want you to leave," she said finally. Her voice cracked, and she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I know we've been hard on you, but it's only because we love you. We just want you to be safe." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be fine, but another part of me was still too angry, too tired of the constant manipulation. "I need to leave," I said carefully. "It's not about not loving you or Dad. It's about needing space to figure out who I am." She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "We've always tried to do what's best for you. Maybe we didn't do it perfectly, but we're your parents. We're supposed to guide you." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But guiding me doesn't mean controlling me. I'm an adult now, Mom. I need to start living like one." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying again. Instead, she stood up, smoothed her hands over her jeans, and said, "I just hope you know what you're doing." "I do," I said, even though part of me wasn't entirely sure. The night before my move, my dad finally decided to speak his piece. I was in the middle of taping up a box when he came into my room without knocking, as usual. He stood there for a moment, arms crossed, before saying, "You think this is going to be easy, don't you?" I put the tape down and turned to face him. "No, I don't," I said. "But I can't stay here. You and Mom don't see me as an adult, and I can't live under those rules anymore." He shook his head. "You're going to find out real quick how tough it is out there. You think you've got it all figured out, but you're not ready." That hit a nerve. "I've been paying rent since I was a teenager," I shot back. "I've been handling my own expenses, my own life, while still living here and dealing with all the rules you've thrown at me. If I'm not ready now, when will I be?" He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something about me being too stubborn for my own good, and walked out. I sat back down on the floor, staring at the half-packed box in front of me, trying to shake off the frustration. The morning of the move came faster than I expected. Grandpa arrived early, his truck ready to load up my things. My parents didn't come outside to say goodbye, which didn't surprise me. As we carried the last of my boxes out to the driveway, I caught a glimpse of my mom watching from the kitchen window. I couldn't read her expression, and honestly, I didn't want to try. When we were finally on the road, Grandpa glanced over at me and said, "You did good, kid. It's not easy standing up for yourself, especially with family." I nodded, staring out the window as the familiar streets of my childhood faded into the distance. "I just hope it was the right call," I said quietly. "It was," he said firmly. "You'll see." As we drove toward what felt like a new beginning, I felt a mix of emotions, nervous, excited, and a little sad. I wasn't sure what was waiting for me at the end of this road, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something better. When we arrived at Grandpa's house, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. His home was tucked away on a quiet street lined with big trees, the kind of place where you could hear birds chirping instead of cars honking. It wasn't huge, but it was cozy. The front porch had a swing that creaked gently in the breeze, and the garden out back was bursting with flowers and vegetables. Grandpa helped me unload my things without saying much, which I appreciated. He wasn't the kind of guy to smother you with questions or advice unless you asked for it. Once everything was inside, he clapped me on the back and said, "Welcome home. Make yourself comfortable." The room he'd set up for me was simple but inviting. A twin bed with a quilted blanket, a wooden desk by the window, and a bookshelf half filled with old paperbacks. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking around and letting the quiet sink in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I didn't have to worry about someone barging into my room or judging how I spent my time. It was peaceful, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until I had it. That first week at Grandpa's was like a breath of fresh air. I settled into a routine, working on my business during the day, helping him with small tasks around the house, and spending evenings talking or watching old movies together. He was patient with me, never prying or pushing for details about why I'd left. When I finally did open up, it felt natural, not forced. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, I told him everything. About the rent, the constant guilt trips, the feeling that I was more of a tenant than a son. He listened quietly, nodding here and there, but didn't interrupt. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "Sounds like they were trying to hold on to you and push you out at the same time," he said finally. "That's a hard line to walk, and they didn't handle it well." I nodded, grateful that he wasn't defending them or trying to downplay how I felt. "I just don't understand why they couldn't see how much it was hurting me," I said. "I mean, I've been paying my own way for years. What more did they want?" "Control," he said simply. "Sometimes parents don't know how to let go. They think they're protecting you, but really, they're just holding you back." His words hit hard because they felt so true. I'd spent so much time feeling frustrated and angry, but hearing it framed that way made me realize how tangled their intentions might have been. It didn't excuse their behavior, but it gave me a new perspective. As the days turned into weeks, I started feeling more like myself again. Without the constant pressure and tension at home, I could focus on my work and my goals. My business was thriving, and I was finally able to dedicate the time and energy it deserved. Grandpa would pop into my room now and then to see what I was working on, always genuinely interested. It was nice to have someone who supported me without any hidden agenda. One day, about 3 weeks after I moved in, my mom called. I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part knew I couldn't avoid her forever. With a deep breath, I picked up. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was softer than I expected, almost hesitant. "How are you? How's Grandpa?" "We're both good," I said. "How are you and Dad?" She hesitated before answering. "We're managing. The house feels empty without you." There was a pause, and then she added, "We miss you." I didn't know how to respond. I'd spent years feeling like a burden in that house, and now she was saying they missed me? It felt like too little, too late, but I didn't want to start an argument. "I miss you too," I said, even though I wasn't sure if it was entirely true. She took a shaky breath, like she was working up the courage to say something. Ethan, I know things weren't great before you left. Your dad and we didn't handle things the way we should have. I just want you to know we're sorry. The apology caught me off guard. For so long, they'd acted like they were in the right, like everything was my fault. Hearing her admit they'd made mistakes was unexpected. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened as she kept talking. We thought we were teaching you responsibility, but I see now that we pushed you away, she said. I don't want to lose you, Ethan. I want us to have a better relationship. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I felt a pang of guilt, even though I knew I wasn't entirely to blame for how things had turned out. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully, but it's going to take time. I'm still trying to figure things out for myself. I understand, she said quietly. I just hope you'll let us try to fix things. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time, staring out at the garden. Her apology didn't erase all the hurt, but it was a start. Maybe they were finally starting to see things from my perspective. Or maybe it was just another way to pull me back in. Either way, I wasn't ready to jump back into anything with them. Not yet. Grandpa joined me on the porch a little while later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He didn't ask what was on my mind, just handed me a cup and sat down beside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the space to breathe, to think, and to figure out what I wanted. And for now, that was enough. Life at Grandpa's felt like a different world compared to everything I'd left behind. I'd found a sense of peace I didn't even know I needed. The days were simple. Mornings spent working on my business, afternoons helping Grandpa with house projects or his garden, and quiet evenings where we'd sit on the porch, drink tea, and talk about anything that came to mind. It wasn't exciting, but it felt real. My mom's apology lingered in my mind, though. I kept replaying her words, trying to decide if they were genuine or just another way to rope me back in. Part of me wanted to believe she really meant it, but another part couldn't shake the years of resentment I'd carried. It wasn't easy to forget how small and controlled I'd felt living in that house. Even so, her call made me think that maybe things could be different someday. Just not yet. A few weeks later, I got another call, this time from my dad. Seeing his name on my phone made my stomach tighten. Unlike Mom, he wasn't the type to admit when he was wrong. I answered cautiously. Hey, Dad. Hey, Ethan, he said. His tone was stiff, not angry exactly, but not warm either. How's it going? It's fine, I said, trying to sound neutral. How about you? Same, he replied shortly. There was an awkward pause, and I could hear him exhale heavily on the other end. Look, I wanted to talk about the way things ended. I know I wasn't exactly understanding when you said you were leaving. That was putting it mildly, but I kept quiet, letting him continue. I guess I just didn't know how to handle it, he admitted, his voice quieter now. It felt like you were giving up on us. Like we'd done something so bad you couldn't even stand to live here anymore. I sighed. It wasn't about giving up on you, I said. It was about giving myself a chance to grow without feeling like I had to justify every decision I made. I wasn't leaving to hurt you. I just couldn't stay. I get that now, he said, though his tone suggested he was still working through it. Your mom and I have talked about it a lot since you left. We didn't handle things the right way, especially with the rent. That admission hit me harder than I expected. For years, they defended charging me rent as a way to teach me responsibility, and now, for the first time, they were acknowledging it might have been a mistake. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully, not wanting to let my guard down completely. But it wasn't just about the rent. It was how you treated me, like I wasn't part of the family anymore. I felt like I had to earn my place in my own home. There was another long pause. I never thought about it like that, he said eventually. I guess. We didn't realize how it came across. We thought we were helping you, but I see now that we pushed you away instead. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to tell him it was too late, that the damage was already done. But another part of me felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe they were finally starting to understand. After a few more minutes of awkward conversation, we hung up. I felt drained but also strangely lighter. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. At least they were trying, which was more than I'd expected when I first moved out. That evening, I told Grandpa about the call. He nodded thoughtfully, sipping his tea. Sounds like they're starting to see things from your perspective, he said. That's a good sign. Yeah, but I don't know if I'm ready to go back to how things were, I admitted. Even if they mean well, I can't just forget everything that happened. You don't have to, he said, but maybe you can let them show you they're willing to change. It doesn't mean you have to jump back into their lives full force. Take it slow. I thought about his advice as the weeks went on. My parents called occasionally, and while the conversations were still a bit awkward, they were no longer filled with guilt trips or veiled accusations. They mostly asked how I was doing, how work was going, and whether I needed anything. It felt strange but nice, like they were finally treating me like an adult. One day, my mom called and suggested we meet for lunch. Just the two of us, she said. No pressure. I just want to see you. I agreed, cautiously optimistic. We met at a small cafe halfway between Grandpa's house and theirs. She hugged me when I walked in, which caught me off guard. It wasn't the overbearing kind of hug she used to give when she was trying to guilt me into something. It felt genuine, like she was just happy to see me. Over lunch, we talked about everything except the past. She asked about my business, my plans after graduation, and even laughed when I told her a story about one of my more eccentric clients. It was the most relaxed conversation we'd had in years. At the end of the meal, she hesitated, then said, I know we're not there yet, but I hope someday we can rebuild what we lost. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. Me too. Driving back to Grandpa's, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was still a part of me that wanted to keep my walls up, to protect myself from being hurt again. But another part of me realized that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't erase the years of tension, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Graduation day came faster than I expected. Grandpa and I drove to the ceremony early that morning, the truck loaded with snacks he insisted on bringing, just in case. As we walked into the crowded auditorium, I spotted my parents sitting near the front. My mom waved, a tentative but genuine smile on her face, and my dad gave me a small nod. It felt strange but good. The ceremony was a blur of speeches and applause. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras, but all I could think about was how far I'd come. Not just academically, but personally. For the first time, I felt like I was living my life on my own terms. Afterward, we all gathered outside, the air buzzing with celebration. My mom hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, while my dad patted me on the back and said, We're proud of you, Ethan. For once, I believed him. Grandpa stood off to the side, watching with a quiet smile. He didn't need to say anything. I knew he was proud too. As we parted ways that evening, my mom said, We're really glad we could be here for you today. Let's keep working on things, okay? I nodded. Yeah, let's. Driving back to Grandpa's, the weight I'd carried for years finally felt lighter. The past wasn't erased, and there was still work to do, but for the first time, I felt like we were heading towards something better. My life was my own now, and that was a victory no one could take away.